class. Now we're going to talk about conflict. Dun, dun, dun. So the thing with conflict is a lot of us avoid it in real life, which means that when it comes to storytelling, there's just not enough juice for your story to move forward. Now, when we look at a story arc, you have this beginning here, which is your introduction or exposition. You have the moment that starts the real story off on the story, which is called the inciting action. And then this is your rising action, which, seems pretty obvious. You have your climax. This is nothing new. This is all stuff you learned in the 3rd grade. Then your falling action. And then you have the end of the story, which, if you've taken too many story classes as I have, it's called the denouement. It's a very French word for the end of the story. So, this is what your story arc looks like. Every single story needs to fit into this pattern. If your story doesn't fit into this pattern, something's wrong, and then we can talk about that. But this is the pattern of the story. Now, a lot of you struggle with your rising action, which happens between this inciting action and the climax. It's okay. It's the hardest part of the story to write. So, when we're talking about conflict, what we're really talking about is rising action. Because we have the inciting action, this is enough to get our interest, right? Something needs to happen at this point for the story to start. So our interest is already here. And then you know from your 3rd grade storytelling that the climax is the highest point of action in the whole story, right? So it's because it's the highest point of action, it's the highest point of interest. Guess what? It's also the highest moment of conflict. So we're going to say conflict, right? Interest, action. Now here's a clue. When you have your conflict, always think of, those big epic films like Braveheart or Lord of the Rings, where everybody's in battle, and there may be a battle at different scenes at different points, but everybody is on stage, everybody is fighting, everybody is resolving their own driving questions and their own conflicts, right? That's an indication that you're in the climax, because everybody is on scene. Nobody is exempt. No one. Right? Except for maybe the barista who gave you your Starbucks cup earlier, right? She's not part of the story, so she doesn't count. But every character who is a part of the story is on scene. So that's how you know that the climax is getting close, when everybody starts to get closer together. So that probably happens about here, but that still leaves a great amount of storytelling that needs to happen that is difficult to write about. Now, the reason it's difficult is often because there's not enough conflict. So now everybody think about a miscommunication with a friend or a family member or whatever. So think about this miscommunication. Okay, first it started off by the topic that you're going to avoid, right? You're still meeting for lunch and still hanging out at this person's house, but you're going to avoid one topic. And when the other person brings it up, you're just going to kind of change the subject, right, and just keep moving forward. Well, then that subject kind of maybe gets a little bit bigger, right? So then maybe you stop going to this person's house, but instead you'll just meet for lunch, right? Because then the idea is as soon as they bring up this topic, then you can just go home, right? So, but you still like this person, you'll still hang out with this person, just maybe not at their house. Okay, well then the topic kind of gets a little bit bigger. So then you kind of dread meeting this person for lunch, right? And then from there, maybe you're avoiding this person's phone calls. Right? And then from there, maybe this person calls you and they're really mad because it's been 3 months and you haven't returned a phone call. Right? And then maybe the next thing you know, you're jumping off a building. Just kidding. But the point is that it escalates, right? Think of any miscommunication, any relationship, a miscommunication escalates. And then you have this tension of returning the phone call, that feeling of dread that they're calling, right? So everybody's had this moment happen at some point in their life. And that is a really great example of how rising action works, right? Because you have something that happens to make your story start, but then you need to have the stakes raised. You need to escalate in tension, escalate in conflict. You need to have characters that, maybe are interested in the topic at hand out here, but then by here they've become like CIA agents and they're going to be murdered if they don't, take the secret envelope. You get the drift. The point is that the rising action is difficult to write unless you have conflict. Now, does this mean all your characters need to be yelling at each other? Absolutely not. It's in fact better that there's subtext, that there's something in the scene that people don't necessarily want to talk about, but they both can sense it, right? Now maybe towards the climax, maybe at that point they might be yelling or whatever. But the point is that you want to be escalating in tension. The stakes need to be raised. With each scene, there needs to be a greater and greater risk that your main character does not get what they want. Now think here to this introduction. By now we've established what a driving question is, right? Your driving question is what your character wants. They want something. They have to want something. Everybody wants something, but especially characters. Characters in a story want something. So they want something, and then each scene should be working towards them getting what they want. So when the conflict escalates and when the stakes are raised, that thing that they want is getting harder and harder for them to attain, which means they have to work harder and harder to get it. Make sense? So then, that's what conflict is. That's what rising action is. So if you realize that the middle of your story is really hard to write, or maybe you're just missing something, ask yourself how your conflict and your tension looks, because that's usually what it is. You need to have conflict. And it needs to be related to what your character wants. It can't just be characters yelling at each other aimlessly with no reason. It needs to be related to what they want. Okay, so that's conflict. If you have any questions, then be sure to email me.